We got Gators Breakdown here. We know we're business.
Gators Breakdown, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I am your host, David Waters. You can find me on social media at GatorDave_SEC. Joining you tonight with my co-host, Will Miles. You can find him at a site, readreaction.com. On YouTube at Will Miles SEC. On Twitter at Will Miles SEC. Will, man, I kind of surprised you this morning with the text. Hey, you want to jump on it now? You released an article. I wanted to talk about the schedule. We have been talking about it on Gators Breakdown Plus a lot lately. I was like, well, that's a popular topic. I'll get to it sometime this summer. And I wake up on Wednesday morning, and there's been my inbox and on Twitter, Will Miles releasing an article about the Gators schedule. I was like, you know what? There's not a better time to talk about the Gators schedule than now. So thanks for and if people are watching on YouTube right now, they can tell you're not at home. You're in a different location. So had to move some things around, but thanks for hopping on with short notice for this episode of Gators Breakdown.
Yeah, man, double secret probation here. Will's on vacation, but quite honestly, doesn't mind getting an hour away from the kids and the nieces and nephews as well. So happy to be on, happy to talk about Florida's schedule. And, look, I think we're all starting to get excited. We're in June now, only a couple of months away. Obviously, the season starts in late August this year, so we're getting close, man. It's funny. It ends so abruptly, either in December or January, hopefully in January this next year, but it always ends abruptly. And then, it feels like you're just sort of out in the desert for a really long time. But we're getting close, man. We're not too far away and excited to talk about the Gators.
Yeah, exciting to talk about the Gators, and really this schedule is so exciting. We all know how hard it is. We won't necessarily go into that side of it. That's been talked about ad nauseum. Preseason magazines are coming out, and hey, number one ranked schedule, Florida, and all these lists on. Hey, look, we know how hard the schedule is. We won't really dive into that side of it too much. We're going to have a little bit of fun with it. We'll talk about our most pivotal games. Or game, and then also kind of discuss, is the schedule as hard? We already know how hard it is, but is it as hard as it looks? We've all had this discussion in some form or fashion, and that was the theme of Will's article too that we'll get into there. But hey, Father's Day is coming up, and one more time, got to do the pub here for Will and Nick, what their great job they did with the Read Reaction 2024 Football Preview Magazine. If you're still looking for that Father's Day gift, you can go to readreaction.com/mag. There's a link right there to get your hard copy. It takes you to Amazon. You can get your digital PDF version, but we'll certainly hope the last few weeks of this thing being out. I see people sharing it all over social media. My friends who have gotten it, sending me pictures, and I'll share that widget, all that good stuff too. But certainly, I think my favorite part so far is I'll go give you even more credit here. You were, so early with the not necessarily being, I guess, Austin Armstrong last year. We go back to that last year, and it took you. Actually, you didn't really come around. You didn't like the hire to begin with, and look, we've talked about it. You've discussed it. The defense was better down to down, but it would get erased by all the big plays Florida gave up. There was some good that happened last year. We'll get to see if that talent makes its jump. But going to, I think probably my favorite part of the magazine is how much Ron Roberts coming in, what he's learned the last few years, and how that will help Austin Armstrong.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the more interesting things that we had in the magazine. I'm glad you mentioned it, which is that Ron Roberts learned something when he went to Baylor and was under Dave Aranda. And I think if you read the magazine, you're going to be able to see some things that we can be looking for that he hopefully brings to the toolbox that Austin Armstrong already has. I don't think anybody ever doubted that Armstrong has the potential to be a good defensive coordinator. I didn't even doubt that. What I doubted, or what I was concerned about, was his propensity to give up big plays at Southern Miss, and that's what followed through in last year against Florida. Now, part of that was his blitz rate. Part of it was the type of coverage that he chooses. And Ron Roberts had similar blitz rates and similar coverages when he was at Louisiana. But then he went to Baylor, and all of a sudden that switched. And then at Auburn last year, you could see that he was sort of using a blend of the two. And so I suspect that's what we're going to see from Florida this year, is a blend of the different types of coverages, and then a blend of the different types of blitzes that they're going to bring. And I'm just thankful I don't have to see Princely Human out in coverage anymore, especially downfield, because when they use those simulated pressures, and all of a sudden you had a defensive end on a running back coming out of the backfield or a tight end streaking down the field. It was obviously rough for Florida, and they gave up a ton of big plays. But I think, the interesting part of the magazine is that we try to give people reasons for optimism and also reasons for, and also a realistic look, right? So we're not telling you that the defense was great last year. What we're telling you is there's a few signs here that the defense might be able to turn around, and here's some things to look for Ron Roberts and whether he's going to put his stamp on the defense. So I thought that was a really fun part to research and then a fun part to put together. It's towards the tail end of the magazine, so it's funny because that's one of the things that kind of almost got cut towards the end. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, and we're really proud of it. So thanks for putting the link up there, and certainly folks, if you haven't gotten it yet, we're so appreciative of all the feedback, all the people who've posted it on X or Twitter, all the people who've commented on Facebook or sent me a personal email, reviewed it on Amazon, that sort of stuff. The reality is Gator Nation is an awesome place with a lot of awesome people who support you, support me, and support Nick. So we're just thankful that the reception's been good, and hopefully we'll be able to keep doing it for years to come.
All right, one more time, 70 pages of dedicated to the Gators. How does Billy Napier scheme Trey Wilson open? How to know if Graham Mertz has taken another big step forward? Can Austin Armstrong and Ron Roberts turn around the defense? And what does high school performance say about DJ Lagway? There's the highlights right there of the Read Reaction magazine that you can find at readreaction.com/mag. You can get a link there for your Amazon copy, your hard copy there, and the digital PDF version if you want that. So let's keep it going. Hit that like button before we get started talking about this schedule right here on Gators Breakdown. Does a lot of good right here on the YouTube. Subscribe right here on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. That really helps us out right here. Of course, Gators Breakdown Plus conversations going on there in that Discord server. A lot of good discussion there about recruiting recently, of course, and Jay Budd in there sharing his analytics lately as well on the Florida schedule. He did that today. So a lot more schedule talk on the Gators Breakdown Plus Discord. Ad-free episodes as well of Gators Breakdown Plus. And one more time, Gators Breakdown merch, get you new designs there. Of course, the Beat Miami shirts selling pretty well right now. Don't be left out. Get your Beat Miami shirt or just some of those new designs there. Summertime vibes and all that good stuff there at gatorsbreakdownmerch.com. Big thanks for all your help and support right there. So, all right, let's go. Let's talk about this schedule a bit. Will, first of all, I want to talk about what the SEC did this week and all the TV partners, mainly ESPN and ABC, because now SEC is under their umbrella. But let's go ahead and put it up. They gave us some times that, and Will, I know you being up there in Philadelphia, it's always, hey, what game do I go to? What time is kickoff going to be? And a lot of times we don't know that until about a week, 2 weeks before the game. Of course, you get your early season games. We've kind of getting those for years, and we know when kickoff will be. We always know when Florida, Georgia will be, mainly because the city of Jacksonville does not want that game at night. So that's going to be your 3:30 game. But we got this week the rest of the schedule, or most of the rest of the schedule, some flex scheduling. Florida State game not there because it's under the ACC, not the SEC. So that's the only one we don't really even have a window of time for. But if we go through it, Miami at 3:30, we knew that. Sanford at 7, we knew that. Texas A&M 3:30, we didn't know that as well. Those first 3 games we already knew. But then the SEC releases the rest of the schedule, and there are some flex schedules, some different ones here. But the first one we didn't know about. Florida's first road game will be a noon kickoff in Starkville. So early kick on the road for the Gators. And then that first bye week, of course. And then Central Florida, that game will now be kicking off between 6 and 8 p.m. So you get your night game in the Swamp versus UCF. And then we get our first look at some of the big flex window at Tennessee. Either will be in that window of a 3:30 or 8 p.m. kickoff. Same for Kentucky at home in that 3:30, 8 p.m. flex window. Then, of course, another bye week. We knew Georgia at 3:30. Florida, another road game. Florida's trip to Austin. Well, I know a lot of people looking forward to that trip. Well, you better get up early because that's going to be a 12 p.m. kickoff in Austin against the Longhorns. And then when Florida returns home against LSU, that will be another flex. It'll either be a 3:30 or 8 o'clock game. Remember, that is the black uniform game, so I know a lot of people are already wanting that to be an 8 p.m. kickoff against LSU. And then Florida's last home game of the season kind of stinks that the last home game of the season is going to be in nooner against Ole Miss, and as I mentioned, against Florida State, since that's an ACC home game. that schedule. We won't know kickoff. I don't know when that. I think that'll be announced sometime this summer as well. But Will, I like what the SEC has done here. We got a lot better window now. If people are traveling or if people are traveling far, they now know if they want to go to a certain game. They now know if it won't be a noon game. They have a lot more time to plan and tailgate. But I like what the SEC's done here and giving us these kickoff windows.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. Obviously, the new deal with ESPN ABC really helped set this up. It used to be that the SEC, the prime game was always sort of up for grabs for CBS the week before, and they'd sort of decide based on how everybody was playing. But look, I mean, Georgia's going to be in those prime games a lot. Alabama's going to be in those games a lot, probably LSU as well. And look, Florida has fallen from that tier where you say this is going to drive eyeballs and it's always going to be a good game. So that's why you see all these noon games, right? Florida at Mississippi State. Especially if Florida's dropped one of those games against Miami or Texas A&M, not a lot of appeal there. Same thing when you get to at Texas. If Florida's lost to Georgia the week before, how much appeal is there really there? So I understand why they have them at noon. And the reality is if Florida wants to get those 3:30 and 8 o'clock slots, they're going to have to be better than 6 and 7 and 5 and 7 in order to do that. So this is really sort of the start of Florida being able to get those slots. And look, I don't know if the schedule would have been any different had the season just gone along. I suspect it would have been fairly similar. The question then becomes, is it better for fans to have the times up front? I think obviously the answer there is true, right? I mean, even a game like Kentucky that can be flexed from 3:30 to 8, at least it's not a noon game. At least you can make those sorts of determinations. So good on the SEC, good on ABC and ESPN for getting this stuff out here. People could start to plan. And certainly I know there are a lot of people wanting to go to that game at Texas. That's one of those new SEC sites. So knowing right now, where do you need to be? How do you need to get there? All that sort of stuff certainly helps out. And look, I mean, Texas in the Big 12 has played a lot of noon games throughout its history. I mean, you look at the game they play against Oklahoma every year is usually a noon start. So it's not as though
it is 3:30 this year.
Oh, they moved it this year.
Yeah.
I mean, my memory has been that that's almost always a noon game.
No, it is. It has been. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So look, I mean, that's a common thing for some of those teams down there, and we're going to have to get used to it because it's a new world in college football, obviously, with those folks here. And look, I mean, a couple of years ago, I looked at the Florida schedule and I looked at the home games and I went, I don't know which one I want to go to because I'm not sure any of them's really going to be that good a game. And it turns out I went down for the Utah game a couple of years ago and it was awesome. But the rest of the schedule was sort of a little bit of a clunker. And this year and next year, that will not be the case. Any fans who have season tickets for Florida games are going to get to see everybody and they're going to get a good experience when they're in the swamp. So just from the standpoint of the schedule is more enjoyable for fans, but also now we can enjoy the tailgate and plan all that sort of stuff and figure all that stuff out well in advance. Only good for college football fans.
Yeah, I mean, you got to look ahead. Well, what game do I want to go to? Ole Miss is at noon. Well, now you make a decision. If you want that later game, you can go to the Kentucky game. You can go to the UCF game if you want to go to a home game there for the Gators. So, of course, Ole Miss, but definitely the better opponent out of those. So you kind of have to sacrifice. Do you want to go better opponent, or are you preferring game time if you only get to go to 1 or 2 games a season there? But hey, look, the noon game is also much better than it used to be, especially if that game is on ESPN, ABC. That's like the 3rd or 4th tier game overall. Now, like a noon game on ESPN, ABC is certainly still getting more eyeballs than a primetime SEC network game just because of the channel that they're on. So that noon window, not as it's not the 12:31 or 12:21 old school Jefferson Pilot kickoff that you would get when the game is on ESPN or ABC there. But yeah, we got our. Good.
Well, the other thing to think about for that Ole Miss game is that's right before Thanksgiving break.
Yeah.
So if you're a student, do you stay for a noon game and then take off? You haven't really lost much of your vacation. Whereas if it's a 7 or 7:30 start, maybe you see some of the students filter out of the town, and it just gives it a different feel. So I sort of look at that one because it's Thanksgiving week. You always see this with Florida State too, right? The fans sort of come back for the Saturday game. Last year they had it on Friday, certainly affected the ability for Gainesville to get up quite as much for that one. Though it was a pretty good tailgate scene for that one. But again, I sort of look at it and say a noon game right after everybody's gotten ready to take off for their vacation, maybe not necessarily a bad thing for sort of the casual student fan, and be able to pack the place with loud students rather than more controlled alumni.
For sure, for sure. All right, well, let's get to it. And while we talked about the times here and how that's kind of shaking out there for the Gators, let's take a look at it here. In the title of your article that you released today on readingreaction.com is Florida's schedule really a disadvantage? You asked that question, of course. And look, it certainly is tougher than last season. Or is it tougher than last season? I think some people have asked themselves that question when you go through, especially late in the season, with what Georgia was doing, what Missouri was doing, Florida State was doing, LSU. Of course, those teams were up there near the rankings, fighting for college football playoff spot, trying to fight for SEC championship spots. There, very, very, ended up being a very tough schedule for Florida last year. But I think when you look at it, and when you look at the very first game of the season, I'd rather be hosting Miami than going to Utah. When you take the way the season kicks off, I think Utah's better than Miami anyway. So just looking at the teams just in general, yeah, but also getting to host Miami instead of going on the road versus Utah, I think that's an advantage for this year's schedule over last year's schedule. And then, Tennessee, that one's probably a little harder. You don't have them at home. I think Tennessee's actually be pretty good this year. You do have them on the road, but the cupcake game, you only have Stanford. You had two of those last year. That's where this year's schedule's a bit tougher than last year. But all the first-time quarterback or first-year quarterbacks that you get to play, or whether they're transfers or guys taking over for programs, I think that's another aspect of looking at this schedule. Cam Ward, Miami. Connor Wegman, he's been there for Texas A&M, but he's been injured, so not a first-year guy, but certainly a quarterback with some questions as to if he can stay healthy or not. Of course, all the changes going on at Mississippi State, Tennessee with Nico starting, Kentucky, of course, and their changes at quarterback. LSU, the Heisman winner, no longer behind center for them. Garrett Nussmeier taking over. And then Florida State with DJ Uiagalelei taking over for them. So, while this schedule is certainly tough, I'm not trying to sit here and say it's not tough. I'm not trying to make that headline whatsoever, but I do think, and look, even with all those aspects I think we just discussed or we're about to discuss, that doesn't mean Florida's schedule's not hard. I still think it, with all those aspects and topics we can discuss, I still think that means Florida's schedule is the toughest, but is it as tough as it looks?
Well, and so the article I wrote didn't even really try to deal with that. It kind of just said, yeah, let's assume it's tough.
Yeah.
But now let's look at the baseball team, right? The baseball team's going to College World Series, and they were barely above 500. It wasn't entirely clear they were going to make the NCAA tournament. And then they make the tournament, and they're now a hardened team that's played tough games against tough opponents all year long. Now, look, half the College World Series is now SEC teams. So clearly Florida's schedule was difficult. It's not a sin to lose to those teams throughout the regular season. But now you've got a hardened team that's used to playing in adversity, playing in the postseason. Teams like Nebraska and teams like Oklahoma State and teams like Clemson hadn't necessarily gone through that same gauntlet that Florida had. So Florida's able to make it to the College World Series. Now, look, it's a 64-team tournament, obviously, and so you don't have to be perfect to get in, but college football is no longer as exclusive as it was last year, and certainly as exclusive as it was 15 years ago. You don't have to be in that top 2 or top 4, and it's not an undefeated season that automatically gets you in. In fact, we saw that with Florida State last year. Their strength of schedule kept them out of the college football playoff because they didn't play anybody. Well, no one's going to have that argument for Florida. So Florida, if they can put together a run to start with. So, Matthew Walker here has a great comment about it's only the last 5 that are daunting, right? There is a world where Florida is 6-0 going into that game against Kentucky. And, maybe Vandegrift falls apart there at Kentucky and all of a sudden they don't have a quarterback again. And yeah, there's absolutely an opportunity for Florida to take advantage of that. But more than that, to me, it's that you're going to get some certainty from a tough schedule. Right. So either Florida goes 8-4, 9-3, and we really feel good about where the Napier era is going because of the transfer portal, because of DJ Lagway, because of Graham Mertz, because of the wide receivers stepping up, because the defense looked better. Or I think the team goes 3-9 and Florida's making a change, but everybody is pretty confident that that's the right move to make. And, much like you mentioned I live in Philly. I lived through the whole process where Philadelphia was tanking to try to be good. And one of the problems that Philly's got right now on the basketball team is they've got Joel Embiid, but they don't have anything else, or Tyrese Maxey, but they don't have anything else. And the question is, how do you build around that guy? And when do you make a change? And is it time to move on? Those are questions they have to answer. And they're sort of in this weird tweener level where they're not a championship level team, but they're not a terrible team. And so they sort of sit in the middle. You don't want to be in the middle, whether you're in the SEC, whether you're in the NBA, Major League Baseball, whatever that is. And so, the reality is I think we're going to get some certainty coming out of this year. And if Florida goes 8-4, I think you really got to talk about putting, and it probably depends on the 4, but if Florida went 8-4, can you make an argument that an ACC team is better than them, even if they're 9 or even if they're 9-3, or even 10-2? I think.
Wait. Oh, there you go. All right, throw this scenario in there. If you're going to put that, but before you move on to another topic here, say Florida goes 8-4. All 4 of those losses are to SEC teams. Florida State's the ACC champion, but Florida beats them in the season finale.
Yeah, and all of a sudden
that could happen.
Sure, it could. And I mean, honestly, so I kind of want the schedule to be as hard as we think it is, right? I want Miami to be a top 25 team, not because I like Miami, but because I want to beat them. I want Texas A&M to be a top 25 team. I want Ole Miss or Mississippi State to be borderline. I want UCF to be one of the best teams that's not in a major conference. I want Tennessee to be halfway decent. So that win means something. I want Georgia to be, what Georgia's been, but I want Florida to be competitive with them. Again, same thing with Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, and FSU. And then at the end of the day, say we went 8-4 against this gauntlet. Like, how dare you punish us for that? And if you punish them for that, well, then you've made it very clear how you should schedule. And so it's time to go. It's time to go schedule the Citadel, and it's time to go schedule, Eastern Mississippi State, or it's time to go schedule the directional schools and just make that your non-conference schedule. Tell Florida State, no thanks, we don't want to play this game anymore, and go out there. Now, look, I don't want that to happen. I love the rivalries. I want us to play Florida State every year. I want us to play Miami every year. But you got to reward a team who takes on Miami, Samford, UCF, and Florida State versus Florida State, who's going to take on Florida and a bunch of also-rans. And then the other thing that I mentioned in the article, and I think this is actually important, and I don't have enough data to really go back and say, does it make a difference? But I have been wondering for a while now, the fact that Georgia basically played nobody last year until they played Alabama, and all of a sudden they got hit in the mouth in that first half. And I think if you'd have played 6 quarters in that game, Georgia beats Alabama. But the fact that they played 4 quarters meant that Alabama was able to jump on them and Georgia had to try to come back. And I wonder if one of the reasons that happened is Georgia just wasn't challenged until the SEC championship game. And I think you can say the same thing about Texas A&M, where Texas A&M was very challenged last year, and they were able. They made a decision on Jimbo Fisher because they had that tough schedule. And look, if they'd have gone 9-3 against Georgia's schedule, would Jimbo still be there? Absolutely. So I think from both sides of the coin, you can say, hey, it's good to have a tough schedule because that tough schedule reveals who you really are, and then you can make decisions off of that. And look, I think Georgia was probably the best team in the country last year, but I think the fact that they were not tested until that Alabama game meant that 2 things. One, it meant that they weren't ready for Alabama in that SEC championship game. And the other thing that it meant was one slip up and you fall out of the top 4 because there's nothing else to hang your hat on. Right. So for Florida in 2024 and 2025, they're going to be able to sit there and have a slip up or 2 along the way. So, you think about you were tweeting something the other day, Dave, about like the moment in Gator football that left you with your mouth open. And I don't remember exactly what yours was, but mine was
it was the Marco Wilson cleat.
Yes, that one, which probably cost Florida a shot at a national championship. And then mine was the Jordan Reed fumble that ended the 6 turnover game there for Florida against Georgia back when I was going to school there. And you look at those 2 moments, and those moments don't stick with you the same way they do because it just would have been a blip, right? That 2012 team for Will Muschamp that where Reed had those fumbles and they had all those turnovers, that team would have made the playoff easy.
Yeah.
And the Florida team, had they beaten Alabama in the SEC championship game in 2020, would have made the playoff. So that's always been my argument against the playoff, is that those sorts of moments go away.
Right.
And those moments are kind of what makes college football. But look, they've made the decision at the college football level that they're going to have a playoff. And what that means is you're going to have the opportunity to have a junk game. You're going to have an opportunity to have like a kick six type of breakdown that makes college football great. And you're going to have those sorts of things happen, and it won't knock you out of the playoff. And so I think the certainty that you get from a tough schedule, along with the bona fides that when who other than an SEC team is Florida going to go up against where someone says, oh, yeah, the schedules are close, so record now matters? I mean, I think the only thing that had happened is, like, let's say Miami beat Florida to open the season, and then at the end of the day it came down to Miami and Florida, then everybody would say, well, head-to-head, so we got to reward that. But other than that, I mean, if Miami ends up running the table and wins the ACC next year and Florida beat them to start the year, Florida should be in. Same thing, like you said, at the end of the year if they beat Florida State. So I think there's a lot of benefit to having a tough schedule. And now Billy Napier and his staff just need to make the most of it. And they've been preaching patience, and they've been telling us that we need to be that we need to understand this is a build and all that sort of stuff. But the reality is, at some point, you got to see the house, right? Like, the studs can be up, the foundation can be poured, but at some point, the house has to start to make an appearance.
That's what I've been preaching.
Yeah, and year 3 is really when that has to happen. So, like I said, we're going to get certainty one way or the other, and I think that's a good thing to have certainty one way or the other. What you don't want to do is have to make a change or have to sign an extension where half the fan base is already against either one, right? Because then you're just sort of the old Will Muschamp noise in the system. And Ron Zook noise in the system. You're just sort of getting that vibe. And that's what happened to Muschamp in that 2014 season, where they gave him one extra season. And it was pretty clear that the fan base was divided. You don't want that to happen. So to me, anything that avoids that division is a good thing. So that's why I said that this season's schedule is an advantage, because we're going to know. Right? We're either going to know it's time for a change. The house doesn't look right. The foundation wasn't poured right. And it's time to make a change and get a new contractor in. Or all that foundation building, all the talk about being patient, all that sort of stuff was correct. And yeah, the house took a little bit longer to build than we wanted it to, but the house looks damn good now, and it's going to stand for a bunch of years. And let's make sure that we do make the best of it.
Well, I think 9-3 would probably be top end for most people's predictions. You mentioned 8-4, but just imagine if it is 8-4, and Florida beats Miami and Florida State. Now, those two teams have two of the highest top 3 odds to win the ACC. It's Florida State, Clemson, and Miami. Those are the top 3 teams in the ACC. If Florida was to go 9-3, 8-4, but beats both Miami and Florida State, and one of those teams win the ACC championship game, how could you keep them out with that schedule? Now, don't get me wrong. On the surface, it would be tough for me to swallow an 8-4 team making a college football playoff. It really would. But at the same time, if you were to beat both Miami and Florida State, and they were part of those 8 wins, and those teams might be in the same conversation, or one of those teams might be in the same conversation, okay, probably no issue with it right there. But also at the same time, Will, how weird would it be if Florida goes 7-0 from Miami through Kentucky, and then say loses 4 straight to Georgia, Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, and then beats Florida State, and somehow make the playoff or get in over those teams somehow? It would be a weird feeling season to go 7-0. I mean, look, I know we're talking hypotheticals here. This is kind of a deep dive of the schedule. I know that the likelihood of these things happening. Hey, this is what June's for. We can talk our way through these things. But it would be so odd to see a team start 7-0, 4 straight losses, and then beat your rival Florida State, and then somehow in this 12-team playoff go on to get in over them. But also to another point, Will, this is why the SEC, going to your point of the strength of schedule, and if you're going to be penalized for playing a hard schedule like this is why the conference has got 8 games right now. I mean, this Greg Sankey was trying to take a wait-and-see approach, kind of being conservative with the schedule. We all wanted, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I wanted a 9-game conference schedule. But I can see why he's like, well, let's wait and see. This 12-team playoff is something new. We have no idea how the committee will value a tough schedule versus a one-loss or undefeated team. That's why there's 8 conference games right now. And with this schedule, this is one of the hardest ones with 8 conference games and the OOC games, the out-of-conference games Florida has. But that's why Greg Sankey's in wait-and-see mode. We have no idea how – look, we're getting way ahead of ourselves with Florida. But any SEC team right now who's in this race with a tough schedule, we don't know how this committee is going to value a tough schedule versus a lighter schedule and an undefeated record or one-loss record.
Yeah, so it's hard to just look at rankings because there are some rules about how the 12 teams get laid out.
Correct.
And you've got automatic qualifiers. Nick in our preseason magazine actually pointed out that Notre Dame cannot get one of the top 4 spots.
Correct.
Because they're not in one of these conferences that's eligible for that. So obviously you can't just go straight down the rankings. But I think it is instructive to look. So Arizona last year going to their bowl game was 9-3. They end up 10-3 after the win. They end up 11th overall. LSU also 9-3, win their bowl game, go 10-3. Notre Dame was 9-3. And they were 14th overall in the rankings. They end up 10-3. Oklahoma State was 9-4. Win their bowl game, end up 10-4. They were 16th in the rankings. So if you're talking about a 12-team playoff and an 8-4 Florida team potentially being able to sneak in there, now I think a lot of it has to do with how many SEC teams are in front of them. Yeah. And I actually think that's probably going to be the major disadvantage. Is you look at the College World Series and no one's upset about 4 ACC and 4 SEC teams because they earned it from a 64-team field. There is going to be a feeling where, well, we've already got 3 or 4 SEC teams in. We already have 3 or 4 Big Ten teams in. So can we really allow another ACC or another Big Ten team in that's sitting there at like an 8-4 type of record? I think that's a legitimate gripe when you're talking about access to the tournament. At the same time, I think this sort of goes back to what you said about what Florida ends up doing. I'm not entirely sure whether it's better to lose to those SEC opponents or whether it's lose to the ACC opponents so that you can then make an argument that head-to-head you beat X in your conference who you're competing with for that spot. I actually think there's probably going to be more SEC on SEC competition for those playoff spots than there's going to be SEC versus ACC. Now, look, you'll have those things pop up every once in a while, but I think Florida is going to be competing with the LSUs and the Texases and the Georgias and the Ole Misses of the world for those playoff spots for teams that have very similar records. More than anything, because I think, especially early on, there's not going to be this drive to have 7 SEC teams out of 12 playing for the playoff, even if 7 of those teams might be 7 of the best 12 in the country. And so we'll just sort of have to see how that washes out. But again, if I look at the rankings last year, 3 losses probably gets you in. And what we're saying is a number 1 schedule with 4 losses, and especially in the case that you laid out there, where you've got wins over both Miami and Florida State. Let's say they're 1-2 in the ACC. What does that do then for your strength of schedule and how people would look at it? I think you're going to see a lot of stuff pop up with the FPI, with just general rankings that are out there that, like it does in college basketball, right? Where people start talking about tier 1 wins or quad 1 wins, and they start talking about quality wins, and they start talking about the teams that you beat that were terrible and how those don't really count and all that sort of stuff. And all of a sudden you end up with a team from the SEC with a much worse record getting into the big dance over someone who's maybe in a lower tier conference who has a much, much better record. Saw that with Indiana State this past year, where they didn't get into the tournament, even though they had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar there on the team. And that combination, I think, is something we're going to start to see with college football. Now, it's not going to be the same, right? It's not going to be the same type of comparison. And I don't think you're going to have an 8-4 team in over a team that goes 11-1. But when you start really parsing hairs, if you're going to penalize people for having a tough schedule, you're going to get what you've asked for. You're going to get people who schedule cupcake schedules, and you're never going to get the SEC to expand to 9 games that way. If you reward the tough schedule, well, now maybe Sankey decides, hey, it's worth having that 9th game. And that, with a difficult non-conference game, puts us in a position where we can dominate the playoff and dominate the spots. Hey, then it's a good move financially for the SEC to do that, and it's certainly a good move for ABC or ESPN to have those quality games on every single weekend.
Well, that's the thing, too. Here's the thing. If Greg Sankey and the SEC get enough teams in with just 8 conference games, That's another angle to this. They may not never move to 9 conference games because it's tough enough with just 8 conference games. So that's another angle to this. How many games have you played and how tough your schedule is as well. But as we certainly know, not many in the SEC. It's tiered. Like your top of your conference, what you would consider your big boys of the SEC, and the teams that spend a ton of money. Your Florida, your Georgia, your LSU, your Alabamas, your Auburns have tougher schedules than your Vanderbilts, your Mississippi States, your Ole Misses, Missouri. That they tiered the schedules that way, and that's one reason Florida's schedule is so hard conference wise there. But look, neither one of us right now are saying we expect that scenario to play out for Florida. But if it does, and kind of going to Will's point, that's the advantage of the schedule Florida has comparing it to the baseball team right now. Maybe it pays off in the football sense down the road for these Gators. So, all right, Will, let's pop up the schedule one more time and let's kind of go through. Just pick one game as the most pivotal game right here. I posed the question to Gators Breakdown Plus members earlier today. Well, I'll get into their thoughts too, because I knew this was going to be varied response here. Personally, for me, it's always Georgia. That's just my personal one. But we got to realize where Florida is right now, where Georgia is right now. But also, zooming out, what is the most pivotal game for this team, this 2024 team? What game do they have to win for a successful season? There's many options here, I think, when you look at it. There's Miami, there's UCF, Tennessee, Georgia, Texas, LSU, FSU. However you want to look at it, whether it's rivalries, whether it's in-state teams, whether it's highly ranked teams, those scenarios are there for you to be the most pivotal opponent that Florida has on the 2024 schedule. Will, do you want me to go first? Do you want to go first? How do you want to do this one?
Let's see what you got.
Okay.
What's your opinion here?
Not trying to make the headlines here or anything like that. I'm going Kentucky. Kentucky's the most pivotal game for me for the 2024 Gators because just think about it. This game has meant the last couple of years that Florida wasn't going to have a very good team. It was an indicator of the team Florida was going to have the last few seasons, last couple seasons specifically, because Kentucky was 7-6, Will, the last couple of seasons. These weren't good Kentucky teams that were beating Florida the last 2 years. They haven't beaten a good Florida team since 2018. You got to go back 3 years ago when also Kentucky went 10-3, but still not beating a good Florida team. 2018 was the last time both teams were good, and Kentucky got that win that broke the 33-year streak that Florida had. But 2 years ago, Kentucky went 10-3, but still not beating a good Florida team. The last 2 years, not beating a good Florida team, but they haven't been that great either. So, while Kentucky, they certainly have taken steps under Mark Stoops, the only good Florida team they have beaten was in 2018. So, to me, what this game has signified is what type of season Florida is going to have. It is a bit different this season, Will, because the Kentucky game comes mid-season. Kentucky doesn't have all offseason to start with to play cupcakes and prepare for Florida all offseason. We'll have an idea of what both teams are heading into this year's matchup. But if recent history is any indication, if Florida loses this game to the Wildcats, a fourth in a row, I think we'll already be pretty disappointed with the direction of the season heading into the game. I think if Florida loses to Kentucky, I think it'll probably be Florida's third or fourth loss of the season already. That's just how I think about Kentucky right now, and that's kind of where I think Florida would be. I just don't think it's a good indication. It'll be an indication of a good season for Florida. Now, Florida could be trending in the right direction and still suffer a loss here. But, a loss in this game, in my mind, probably ensures this season has been a disappointment up to that point.
Yeah, I think what you just said, though, there is one of the reasons why I don't pick Kentucky as the sort of fulcrum point for Florida for the schedule. As you said, that if they lose to Kentucky, then it means they've already got 3 or 4 losses, and 3 or 4 losses with what's coming after the Kentucky game means we're looking for a new head coach is really what it boils down to, whether they win that game against Kentucky or not, right? If they got 3 losses going to that Kentucky game, I think they've really got problems when it comes to what's coming in the future, irrespective of whether you think Ole Miss is a powder keg ready to explode or if FSU's not going to be as good as Uiagalelei. We've seen what happens when Florida gets off to bad starts and coaches are essentially already on the firing squad. And, I don't want to say quit, but the McElwain game against Georgia when everything leaked that he was out, the way Florida played against South Carolina when Dan Mullen was on the hot seat, and then against Missouri, those sorts of things, the way the seasons go downhill. To me, the Kentucky game maybe is the coroner, but not necessarily the murderer season if that goes on. I'll pick a week earlier. I think at Tennessee. I think there's a few reasons for that. One is everybody thinks the Vols are really good this year, so it's a little bit of a bellwether for where Florida sits. Florida's 17-2 in the last 19 meetings between these teams. Florida doesn't lose to Tennessee. So if you lose to Tennessee, again, I think that sort of goes to what you're talking about. But I think maybe that's Florida's second loss if they lose to Tennessee. And still heading into that gauntlet, to me, you're getting into that uncertainty zone that I don't like, where you're sitting there 6-6, 7-5, 5-7, going, well, maybe. And then the other thing is that you're coming off a game against KJ Jefferson, who just terrorized them last year.
Mm-hmm.
So if Florida's defense can stop Jefferson and Gus Malzahn with UCF, and then they can go on the road at night, most likely, I would guess, against Tennessee. And look, Nico Iamaleava, he completed less than 60% of his passes in high school his senior year. That doesn't profile well. And certainly Vol phenom quarterbacks have had a little bit of trouble against the Gators over the last, 3 decades. And so I think this is one of those where you're facing 2 very unique offenses. The Malzahn offense and then the Heupel offense are very different and they're very unique. And so if Florida can shut down both of those offenses back to back, I think that says a ton about Austin Armstrong, about Ron Roberts, about the transfers they brought in, and really what Florida needs to do. Because if you look at EPA per play or you look at EPA differential or any of those sorts of things, if Florida has the exact same offense in 2024 that they had in 2023 and their defense is just serviceable, slightly above average, you've got a team that's now snuck into the top tier of the SEC. And the only one of these teams on Florida's schedule to start with that would have been in the top tier of the SEC. Now, look, Georgia's way out there. Then there's a grouping of teams that kind of consists of Ole Miss, LSU, Tennessee, those sorts of teams. And then the next tier was Florida, Auburn, Mississippi State, Kentucky, those sorts of teams. And last year, at least, the tier 1 teams went 17-1 against the tier 2 teams. And so if Florida can sneak into that space, then beating Tennessee sort of indicates we've arrived as one of these tier 1 teams, assuming that you have the stuff I've talked about happening before, right? That you take care of business against Miami, that you looked good against UCF, all those sorts of things. So I sort of look at that Tennessee game as the one. If you drop that one and that's your second or third loss of the year, it's disaster. If you win that one and you've only got 1 loss or maybe even 0 losses heading into Kentucky, well, now we are having that conversation about we just got to get to 8-4. 8-4 and make the argument, 9-3 and you're in. And if you're having that argument coming out of that Tennessee game, to me, I think all of a sudden the recruits start looking at it and going, hey, Napier's going to be here for a long time. I think NIL, all the people who support that are now all of a sudden throwing in because they start buying into the vision. And look, we talk all the time about recruiting is about hope, and in college football, it's about preaching championships or winning championships and hope. And a win over Tennessee in this case, to me, gives the program a ton of hope heading into that Kentucky game. Now, obviously, if you then face plant against Kentucky, all that hope goes away. But as we saw last year, right? But to me, I would point to that Tennessee game. I almost always point to the Tennessee game,
yeah,
the third game of the year, as sort of the bellwether for where Florida's going to be. Obviously, Florida's had some rough patches the last few years, even though they've been able to take care of Tennessee. But name me a year where Florida lost to Tennessee where they had a great year, and you're
we just haven't lost to them that many years, so we can't really do it too much.
Hey, that again, I look at it and say you can't.
That's kind of that was kind of my Kentucky argument, though. But I go back to. Yeah, I know what you're saying because of where it is.
Well, that, and then I also go back to the recruiting for Tennessee and Florida has been very,
Yeah.
very similar. And so those are the teams you have to beat. Now, you got to beat Kentucky's too, because their recruiting hasn't been as good as yours. But when you get deeper into the season, look, Texas has out-recruited Florida. Georgia's out-recruited Florida. Ole Miss, at least in the transfer portal, based on what we think they have coming in, has probably out-recruited Florida. Florida State's kind of equivalent, and LSU's out-recruited Florida. So you start looking at those teams on the back end of the schedule, and you go, those are teams that a loss is like acceptable from a talent perspective. Now, it might not be acceptable because you should be bringing in better talent when you're in Florida,
Right.
but at least from a roster and the Jimmies and Joes who are on the field, you go, okay, that team, you didn't get out schemed. If you start losing to Tennessee, UCF, Kentucky, now you're talking about getting out schemed. And I think that even bolsters the argument that everybody's making. And if you go look at the chat and YouTube, you'll see there are people who are already anti-Billy. So that bolsters those folks' arguments. And quite honestly, I think I agree with them at that point. If you for the third year in a row, if you're losing the teams who have less talent than you or equivalent talent to you, then what does it say about you as a coach? And I think Tennessee's about as close to Florida in terms of overall talent, the way the program's been built. Tennessee has that 5-star guy that they're trying to use at quarterback to offset the roster deficiencies that they have. It's really kind of like looking in a mirror. And the question is it a funhouse mirror or is it a mirror where, hey, all of a sudden Florida looks skinny and ready to go out to the club? We'll find out in Knoxville coming up, week 6 of the season.
Yeah. Going through probably a little small there, but I'll share some of the Discord thoughts. And MVP, nothing but positivity. He said Texas A&M, Will. Similar talent, similar questions, similar expectations. If Napier is going to be process, details, culture, he has to show the value of that by being ahead of year one Elko. Goldie Rogers says, I want to say Miami because that could set the tone for the season. That was going to be that's my second one. He goes, however, under Napier, a good or bad start against Utah the last 2 seasons led to bad records. He says, I'm going to say Kentucky. We should be 5-1 heading into that game. Napier needs to 6 wins before the difficult back half of the season. Gators in 15 says Tennessee. So there we go. Will, we got somebody agreeing with Kentucky and we got somebody agreeing with Tennessee right here for us both. Gators in 15. Yeah. Gators in 15. He says Tennessee. He goes, assuming we're 5-0 by that time with the games we should win already, mostly by us. A Tennessee win already gets us bowl eligible and closer to 8 wins than 5. Chot says UCF or Kentucky. Can't lose either. Swagadelic says Miami for a few reasons. First game of the season. Number 2, it's a rival. 3, it's in-state, and we compete for the same recruits. 4, both programs are in similar spots with underperforming third-year coaches. And then John says it's Miami. Lose to Miami, and Napier is most likely cooked. It's pivotal for recruiting in-state. It's pivotal if this team has any hope of playing a bowl game. So thanks to Gators Breakdown Plus members. I threw the question in there to them earlier today. But, yeah, kind of echoing what we see here in the YouTube chat too. Cooley, of course, Billy better not lose to Miami because if he does, he might as well get a moving company and put his house for sale. Cooley also goes on to say to lose to Kentucky and we have more talent than them, that would be the end, no coming back. Thomas Moss brings up a good point, kind of going what we were just saying here. On the Discord side of things, you can say like 6 different games and you wouldn't be wrong. That is the nature of Florida's schedule this year. Of course, JC comes in and says, of course, when people were talking about this game or that game, JC says, I think it would depend on how bad the losses are. If it's procedural and mental errors like the past 3 years show zero improvement in football fundamentals, that will certainly go a long way in what people think about this team as well. So, yeah, good feedback there. Derek Powell says, yeah, hard to spin a narrative with L's to UCF, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So, yeah, we know it's a tough schedule. But, Will, I think my message has been it's year 3. This is your roster. This is your image. You overcome the schedule. I know in the building they think that way. There's a sense of confidence in the building as well. And another angle to this, embrace it. I mean, everybody's talking, every preseason magazine, every podcast, every sports radio show out there that covers Florida, you're not getting past a preview of Florida this summer without the schedule being mentioning first or second with this team. So go out there, embrace it. It's going to be exciting. There's a ton of exciting home games there. So I'm excited for a lot of good football, hopefully on the winning side for Florida.
Well, I mean, here's the reality. Florida State started out last year and had 0 shot at winning the national championship. 0 shot because they won all their games and they got left out of the playoff. And so there's zero way that happens to Florida. Florida starts their season in a real conference with the ability to potentially play for a national championship if they play well enough. And you can't say that about all the conferences. You can't say that about all the teams. And so Florida's set up to be able to do that. Now, look, Billy Napier needs to pull off a lot of stuff in order for that to happen. Florida has to be better than I think people like you and I even think. But the reality is if you're going to play college football and you're going to play in a major conference, you want the opportunity to play for a championship. Whether you achieve it or not, you want that opportunity. And I think for the folks at Florida State, that's one of the reasons why they were so upset about what happened last year is the injury to Travis happens and all of a sudden everybody just goes, well, nope. Not going to put you in there. And there was nothing they could have done from that point on. I think even if they'd have looked impressive, people would have found a way to leave them out just based on the way things fell. So Florida doesn't have that problem. They have a different problem, and they need to solve that problem. but the schedule is what it is honestly for the next 2 years. And like I said, I think you're going to get certainty coming out of this year. The people who are saying Billy better not lose to Miami, well, he'll get past the Miami game if they lose that game. But if they lose to Miami, he's not getting past the rest of that gauntlet unless everything changes after the first game. And I think we saw last year that, that Utah game was sort of the harbinger for what Florida was going to be. So I think Miami in many ways will be that harbinger of what Florida's going to be. And I think you'll sort of see that throughout the year. Again, the nice part is the schedule's backloaded. So you're not going to have to deal with this. I don't think Billy needs to be fired after the first 6 or 7 games, even if Florida's kind of finding its legs. I think they'll be able to win enough games to where people will still be on the fence. But I think once you get done with that gauntlet on the back end, we'll know one way or the other. And to me, that's important. Just knowing is critical. Because if you look at Texas A&M and how much time they've wasted over the last few years just sort of waiting for Jimbo, because there was half of the fan base was like, but look at the recruiting and look at what's going on. And the other half was looking at it and saying everything on the field looks like crap and we can't beat anybody. And you start combining those two things and now you've got a fan base that's fractured. And it wasn't until last year, about halfway through the season, where all of a sudden everybody sort of said, okay, but how many years did it take Texas A&M and how much money and the extensions and the buyouts and all that sort of stuff? The last thing you want to do is make that decision after Napier gets an extension, right? What you don't want to do is give him a 6-year extension because he has a halfway decent year this year to instill confidence in the recruits and then a year later have to get rid of him. So to me, certainty, there is extraordinary value in certainty, and the schedule brings that out. Whether that means we're talking about a new coach at the end of the year or whether that means we're talking about the extension for the coach at the end of this year, I just want to be certain that that's the right move for the program to make, and I'm hopeful that the schedule is going to bring that to the fore.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Didn't know we'll have this episode, 13 hours ago, Will, but we go. I won't even say we threw it together. We did pretty good here. So hey, that's just years of working together.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. And it's funny. Like I was pessimistic coming into the season or coming into the off season. And then the transfer portal has sort of ticked up my interest in what's going on. The addition of Ron Roberts has really sort of ticked up my interest in terms of what's going on. And just quite honestly, writing the preseason magazine did it too. I know people tend to look at me and say I'm negative, and most of the time that's because I'm analyzing defensive numbers from Florida's defenses for the past half decade, and that's going to make you negative. But the reality is writing the preseason magazine has given me some optimism for what's coming. And so, look, maybe I'm just a rube and I'm being hopeful, but I think there are a lot of signs. And so I'm excited to see what Florida could put out there on the field this year in a way that maybe I wasn't last year. I think last year I looked at it and was hoping to be wrong, but suspected Florida was going to struggle. And this year I'm suspecting Florida's going to struggle, but I think there are reasons to believe they may not and may have an opportunity to take advantage of the schedule. It's a different feeling this year than it was last year. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, but I think the preseason magazine certainly sort of brought some of those things to the fore, that if a bunch of things go right, Florida can have a really, really good season. And last year it was one of those where a lot of things are going to have to go right that are unlikely. And this year, I think there's, from a likelihood perspective, it's more likely that some of those things are going to go right this year than did last year. So I'm feeling more optimistic than at least than I did last year.
Good deal. Good deal. One more time to find out, why Will is a little more optimistic. Readreaction.com/mag. There's this preseason mag right there. Probably not next week because I am headed out on vacation. Maybe the week after that. We'll see. I have already got the national versions of the Athlon and Lindy's, so Will and I will get back together and we'll do our annual dive into the preseason magazines, what the anonymous coaches have had to say. I know there's been floating around already out there, but we'll get into it as well in the next week or two here on Gators Breakdown. But Will, once again, short notice, but thanks for hopping on, man.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. Always fun to be here and always fun to talk Gators. And like I said, I'm optimistic about this season. So looking forward to a couple of months from now when we can finally see a kickoff and start analyzing real games again.
Yeah, Will on vacation now, so we'll let him enjoy it. But that'll do it for this episode of Gators Breakdown for Will. You can find him at readingreaction.com, on social media at Will Miles SEC. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on social media at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thank you for joining us on this episode of Gators Breakdown.